The silence in the parsonage wasn't empty. It was heavy, a thick, smothering blanket that had settled over Esther Hale's life the day they buried her father 3 months back. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, every creak of the floorboards, only made the silence louder. Her life was a loop of quiet chores in the gray Dakota autumn, tending the garden, baking bread, mending linens. The folks in Providence Creek watched her, of course. They saw the preacher's daughter, a perfect little doll of piety and grief, dressed in gray, her hair pulled back so tight it made her head ache. They saw the living monument to the fire and brimstone reverend who had ruled their town with an iron Bible. What they didn't see was the woman underneath, the woman who was drowning in the quiet, suffocating in the shadow of a man made of granite and gospel. At 24, she was an orphan, a spinster, living on borrowed time until the new preacher arrived from the east to claim the parsonage. She was a stranger in her own skin, a reflection in the window she no longer recognized. Then, one afternoon, with the sky bruised purple and threatening a storm, the silence didn't just break, it shattered. It wasn't a knock, it wasn't a voice, it was a sound from the edge of the property, near the woodshed. A frantic, desperate rustling in the dry leaves, followed by a sound that turned Esther's blood to ice. A choked sob, a child's sob. She froze, her sewing needle hovering in the air. This world wasn't kind. Wanderers and hard men drifted through these plains, and her father's protection was now just a name on a tombstone. With a hand that trembled ever so slightly, she put her sewing basket down. She moved to the window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She peered through the wavy glass, and she saw him. A boy. No older than 7 or 8, huddled against the woodshed, his dark hair matted with leaves and grime. His deerskin leggings were torn, and he was shaking. Not from the cold, from pure, absolute terror. He was a Lakota child, and he was hurt. He clutched one arm to his chest, and a dark, wet stain was spreading across the sleeve of his tunic. Blood. Esther knew with a sickening certainty what her father would have done. He'd have marched out there, Bible in hand, and driven the heathen savage from his land. The town would have cheered him on. Fear was the local currency in Providence Creek. To help this boy wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. It was an invitation for suspicion, for scorn, for trouble she couldn't possibly handle. But as she looked at him, huddled and terrified, she didn't see a savage. She saw a little boy. His eyes were wide and dark, like a cornered fawn. And she saw the blood. Something inside the preacher's daughter, something that had been asleep for a very long time, woke up. It was fierce, it was protective, and it was entirely her own. She took one deep, steadying breath, unlatched the heavy back door, and stepped out into the cold Dakota air. Her quiet, predictable life was over. The boy flinched when the door creaked, pressing himself so hard against the woodshed it looked like he was trying to melt into the timber. A small, wounded sound escaped his lips. Esther stopped. She held up her hands, palms open, a universal sign she prayed he'd understand. "It's all right," she said, her voice husky from disuse, softer than she'd intended. "I won't hurt you." The words were meaningless to him, but the tone cut through the fear. His terrified gaze darted from her face to her open hands and back again. She took another slow, deliberate step. The wind tore a strand of hair from her tight bun and whipped it across her face. She impatiently pushed it aside. She knelt in the damp, cold earth, not caring as the chill seeped through her gray skirt. She had to make herself smaller, less of a threat. "You're hurt," she murmured, her eyes on the dark stain on his arm. She pointed to his arm, then to herself, then gestured toward the open kitchen door. A clumsy pantomime of help. It was all she had. He just stared, his small chest heaving, each breath shallow and panicked. She could see the war in his eyes. the deep, ingrained terror of her world fighting against the desperate need for help. Then, as if a string inside him had been cut, his resolve crumbled. A fresh wave of tears cut clean paths through the dirt on his face. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Getting him inside was like coaxing a wild bird into a cage. He moved, with a skittish, trembling uncertainty, poised to bolt at any second. She didn't lead him to the formal parlor with its stiff chairs and her father's judgmental portrait. She took him to the kitchen, the only truly warm room in the house. She sat him on a low stool by the hearth, where the embers of the morning fire still glowed. The silence returned, but this was a new kind, a live wire of tension humming with the unspoken danger that had just crossed her threshold. The boy, this small, terrified stranger, was a secret that could burn her world to the ground, and now he was her secret to keep. His injury was a deep, ugly gash on his forearm. It was caked with dirt and dried leaves, but it wasn't a bullet wound. It looked like he'd snagged it on barbed wire or a jagged piece of metal in a desperate flight from something terrible. Esther fetched a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and her small tin of medicinal herbs. As she began to clean the wound, he hissed in pain, his body tensing, but he didn't pull away. He just watched her. His dark eyes never left her face, searching, questioning, looking for the betrayal he was so certain was coming. She worked with a gentle focus that surprised even herself. She'd tended to her father in his final illness, but that had been duty, a heavy obligation. This was different. This was a choice, a dangerous, reckless choice that felt more right than anything she had ever done. As she cleaned the wound, she noticed a small leather pouch tied to his belt with a rawhide string. It was old and worn smooth. Curious, she gently touched it. The boy flinched, his eyes widening. He wasn't guarding his arm anymore. He was guarding the pouch. Whatever was inside was more important than his own pain. That was the first clue. This wasn't just a random boy who'd gotten lost and hurt. There was a reason he was running, a reason someone would hunt a child. Esther finished dressing the wound with a poultice of yarrow and wrapped it in clean linen strips. She saw the bone-deep exhaustion in his small frame, the way his body was running on nothing but fear. When she was done, she offered him a cup of milk and a thick slice of her morning's bread. He hesitated, his eyes darting from the food to her face. Hunger fought with suspicion. She understood. She took a small bite of the bread herself, showing him it was safe, then pushed the plate closer. That was all it took. He ate like a starving wolf, his small hands trembling. As he ate, Esther's eyes were drawn back to the pouch. What could be so important? After he finished the last crumb, he slumped on the stool, his eyelids drooping. The terror was still in his eyes, but it was banked now, buried under a wave of pure exhaustion. She knew he couldn't stay in the open. She made him a small bed of blankets in the pantry, a dark, windowless room where he might feel safe. As she tucked the last blanket around him, her fingers brushed against the pouch again. This time, he was too tired to resist. With trembling hands, she untied the leather string. It felt heavier than it should. She opened the flap and tipped the contents into her palm. It wasn't a rock or a lucky charm. It was a piece of gold, but it was unlike any gold she had ever seen. It wasn't a nugget panned from a stream. It was lumpy and misshapen, with swirling patterns in it, almost as if it had been melted in a fire and cooled in strange, sacred patterns. It was a secret. And holding it in her hand, Esther knew with a chilling certainty that this small piece of metal was the reason a boy's family was gone and why he was being hunted. The next day was a ghost of a day. Esther moved through her chores in a fog of high alert. Every gust of wind was the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Every snap of a twig was a footstep in the woods. She brought the boy, whose name she still didn't know, food and water in the pantry. For the first time, he gave her the smallest flicker of a smile. a shy, fragile thing that hit her with the force of a physical blow. They existed in a world without words, a fragile bubble of silence and shared secrets. But the bubble was about to burst. She had to go to the general store for flour. The trip she made every week suddenly felt like a walk into enemy territory. The air in Providence Creek was thick with a nervous, twitchy energy. She could feel it the moment she stepped onto the main street. Men were gathered in tight knots, talking in low, serious voices. Their eyes were watchful. Mr. Callahan, the store owner, was polishing his counter with a frantic energy that betrayed his anxiety. "Afternoon, Miss Hale," he said, his eyes not quite meeting hers. He kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting the devil himself to walk in. "There's trouble, Mr. Callahan," she stated, her voice a calm facade she did not feel. "What trouble is that?" she asked, feigning ignorance. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Couple of men rode in this morning. Hard types. Led by a man named Garrett Vance." The name hung in the air, cold and sharp. Esther knew that name. It was whispered in connection with land grabs, rustled cattle, and men who disappeared. Vance was a predator who operated in the gray lands between the law and the wild. "They're asking questions," Callahan continued, his voice barely audible. "About the Lakota. They're looking for a boy." A cold dread, sharp and painful, washed over Esther. It was real. This wasn't just in her head. "A survivor, they say, from some trouble out at the Blackwood Claim." Callahan wiped a spot on the counter that was already clean. "The whole family, gone. They say the boy saw it all, and that he took something." Esther's hand instinctively went to the pocket of her dress, where the strange piece of gold was wrapped in a handkerchief. It felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. "They think he came this way?" she asked, her voice miraculously steady as she placed flour and salt on the counter. Her mind was racing, screaming. "They're checking every homestead, every farm," Callahan said, shaking his head. "The sheriff's with them, but that's just for show. You can tell Vance is the one running things. A mean look in his eye, that one. Best to stay indoors, Miss Hale. Lock your doors." Esther nodded, paid for her goods, and walked out into the tense afternoon air. The short walk back to the parsonage felt like miles. Her bubble of safety hadn't just been pierced, it had been shattered. They were coming. It was no longer a question of if, but when. She glanced at the stark white church next to her home, its cross reaching for a cold, indifferent sky. Her father's God was a God of judgment, of harsh rules and punishment, and she was breaking every single one of them. There would be no divine protection. She was on her own. When she got back to the house, the boy was standing by the pantry door, as if he'd sensed her fear. His body was rigid, a small statue of tension. Their eyes met across the quiet kitchen, and in that moment, she knew she couldn't lie to him. She knelt in front of him, taking his small, uninjured hand. "Men are coming," she said softly. He wouldn't understand the words, but he understood the terror in her voice. He felt the weight of her fear. "We have to hide. A better place." She spent the next hour pacing the house, a caged animal, her gaze fixed on the dirt road leading to the parsonage. She thought of the river, Providence Creek, that curled around the back of the property. It was mostly shallow, but the banks were steep and choked with willows and cottonwoods. It was a wild place, a place the townspeople avoided. It was their only hope. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and blood, she saw them. 3 riders on the horizon, moving with a grim, relentless purpose. One was the sheriff, looking small and defeated on his horse. The man in the middle sat his mount with a chilling arrogance. It had to be Vance. There was no more time. She grabbed the boy's hand. "Come," she whispered, her voice tight with an urgency that needed no translation. He looked at her, his eyes wide with fear, But he didn't pull away. He trusted her. And the weight of that trust was a crushing, terrifying thing. She grabbed her heaviest, darkest wool shawl from a hook by the door and pulled the boy outside. They scurried low to the ground, using the woodshed and the overgrown fence line as cover, two shadows fleeing a coming storm. The cold air bit at her skin, a sharp promise of the freezing night to come. The river was just ahead, a churning ribbon of dark silver in the fading light. The sound of the rushing water was a roar in her ears, drowning out everything but the frantic pounding of her own heart. She scanned the bank, her eyes searching desperately for a place to disappear. And then she saw it, a spot where the current had gouged a hollow beneath the tangled roots of a massive cottonwood tree. The water was deeper there, and a thick curtain of drooping willow branches hid it from the path above. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. "In the water," she tried to explain, her gestures frantic, pointing at the dark hollow, then at the approaching men, who were now close enough to hear if they shouted. The boy stared at the cold, black water, a fresh wave of fear on his face. He was afraid of the river. But one look back toward the house, toward the men who hunted him, and his fear of the water was eclipsed by a much greater terror. He gave a small, grim nod. Esther didn't hesitate. She hitched up her heavy skirts and plunged into the river. The cold was a physical blow. It stole her breath, a brutal, shocking agony that shot up her legs like 1,000 burning needles. She bit down on her lip, so hard she tasted blood, to keep from screaming. She waded deeper, the powerful current grabbing at her clothes, trying to pull her under. She reached back for the boy. She pulled him in after her, and he let out a choked gasp as the icy water swirled around his small waist. She held him tight against her, his shivering body a stark contrast to the numbness spreading through her own. She maneuvered them into the hollow under the bank, pulling the weeping willow branches around them like a funeral shroud. Her heavy wool skirts fanned out in the dark water, helping to break up their outline. She stood in water up to her waist, her back pressed against the cold, slimy mud of the bank, her arms a vice around the boy. And then they waited. The cold was a living thing, a predator all its own. At first, it was just pain, a searing fire in her feet and legs. Then, the pain gave way to a deep, consuming ache that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her teeth began to chatter, a loud, uncontrollable rattling she was terrified the men would hear. She clamped her jaw shut, praying the sound wouldn't carry over the rush of the river. She held the boy's head against her chest, trying to shield him with what little body heat she had left, murmuring wordless sounds of comfort into his damp hair. He was shaking too, a constant violent tremor that she felt in every part of her body. Time ceased to exist. Every minute was an eternity. The sky faded from indigo to black. A sliver of moon appeared, casting a pale, sickly light on the water. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to get out, to run, to escape the torture of the cold. Her legs went numb, then her hips. A terrifying deadness spread upwards, and she realized with a jolt of panic that she could no longer feel her feet at all. She was becoming a statue of ice, with a terrified, beating heart trapped inside. That's when she heard them. The crunch of horse hooves on the gravel path just above their heads, the low, guttural voices of men. "He can't have gone far," a voice snarled. It was Vance. The sound was so close, so terrifyingly close, it felt like he was whispering directly in her ear. Esther stopped breathing. She pressed the boy's face into her shoulder, making her own body a shield. She could feel his heart hammering against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird trapped in a cage. "He's just a whelp," another man said with a cruel, ugly laugh. "Probably curled up and frozen in a ditch by now." Esther squeezed her eyes shut. She prayed to the God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. A God of mercy, not judgment. She prayed for silence, for invisibility, for a miracle. A horse snorted directly above them, the sound loud and explosive in the quiet night. A loose stone, dislodged by a hoof, tumbled down the bank and splashed into the water just a few feet from where they hid. Esther's entire body went rigid. The boy stiffened in her arms. This is it, she thought, a strange, cold calm washing over the terror. They were found. She had done everything she could. She had failed. Then, Vance's voice cut through the darkness again, impatient and angry. Nothing down there but mud and cold water. Waste of time. The sound was like a pardon from the governor. He probably headed south, back toward his own kind. We'll ride out at first light and check the southern trail. She heard the jingle of harnesses, the creak of saddle leather, as the men turned their horses around. Their voices faded, swallowed by the roar of the river and the vast empty darkness of the plains. They were gone. But Esther couldn't move. The release of tension didn't bring relief. It left her utterly and completely depleted. The cold, which had been a sharp, clear enemy, was now a dull, heavy cloak, dragging her down into the dark water. A profound lethargy began to creep over her, a dangerous, seductive warmth blooming in her chest as her body began to shut down, to surrender. In a distant, fading corner of her mind, she knew this is how people died from the cold. They didn't scream. They just fell asleep. She fought against it. She forced her eyes open, trying to focus on the moonlit ripples on the water's surface. She thought of the boy in her arms, his life depending on her. She could not fail him now, not after coming this far. She tried to shift her weight, to take just one step out of the icy water, but her legs refused to obey. They were useless, alien things, no longer a part of her. Panic, colder and sharper than the river itself, began to set in. They had survived the hunters, only to be claimed by the river. She didn't know how long they stood there. An hour? 2? The world had shrunk to the circle of her arms, the shivering boy, and the relentless, numbing cold. She was drifting, her thoughts becoming slow and syrupy, the edges of her vision going dark. She was losing. Just as she was about to let go, to surrender to the peaceful, deadly sleep, a new sound reached her. It wasn't the sound of Vance's men. It was different. It was the soft, rhythmic dip of a paddle in the water. Her head felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but with a monumental effort, she lifted it. Downstream, moving with a silent, ghostly grace, she saw them. 2 canoes, dark shapes against the moonlit water, filled with the silhouettes of men. Her first thought was a fresh spike of terror. Vance had come back. He'd decided to search the river after all. But these men moved differently. They moved with a quiet purpose, a skill that spoke not of plunder, but of pursuit. One of the canoes angled toward her side of the river. A man in the bow raised a hand, and the paddling stopped. They drifted on the current, listening, their heads turning. Esther's heart, which had slowed to a weak, fluttery beat, gave a painful lurch. They were looking for something. For them. The boy in her arms stirred. He lifted his head from her shoulder, and then he let out a small, weak cry. It wasn't a sound of fear. It was a sound of recognition. A name spoken in Lakota. A man in the canoe answered him. His voice was low and resonant, a single word that flowed like the river itself. They hadn't been hunting them. They had been tracking them. They had been tracking the boy and tracking his hunters. The canoe glided closer, its nose nudging the muddy bank right beside her. The man in the front, his face weathered and stern in the moonlight, looked at her. He saw the white woman, her dress soaked and dark, her face as pale as a ghost. He saw the boy she clutched to her chest. His gaze traveled down to where she stood, frozen, rooted in the icy water. And his expression, which had been so hard and weary, changed. It wasn't softness. It was a deep, solemn understanding that passed over his features. Without a word, he and another man slipped from the canoe into the thigh-deep water. They didn't even flinch from the cold. They moved toward her, and Esther felt a single, exhausted tear freeze on her cheek. She had no strength left to be afraid. She had nothing left at all. One of the warriors gently, carefully, took the boy from her arms. The boy went without a struggle, his eyes still fixed on Esther's face, a look of silent, wrenching gratitude that broke what was left of her heart. The other man, the leader, put his strong, steady hands under Esther's arms. "We have you," he said. His English was slow, accented, but clear as a bell. Esther tried to walk, to prove she could stand on her own, but her legs buckled instantly. They were completely useless. The man lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his grip firm and impersonal, and carried her out of the river's deadly embrace. He laid her on the bank, on a thick, warm buffalo robe that another warrior had already spread on the frozen ground. The pain of returning sensation was a new kind of hell. It was excruciating, 1,000 burning needles pricking her flesh from the inside out. They wrapped her in another dry, warm robe, and the scent of wood smoke and leather enveloped her, a scent of life. Through a haze of pain and exhaustion, she watched as the boy was passed to the leader. The stern-faced man held him with the unmistakable tenderness of family. It was his uncle, Tashunka. He spoke to the boy in low, comforting Lakota, and the child, finally safe, finally broke. His small body was racked with the sobs he had held back for so long. Tashunka turned back to Esther. He knelt beside her, his presence immense in the quiet night. He looked at her chattering teeth and her pale, drawn face. He looked at the dark, cold river, and then back at her. For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sounds were the rushing water and the boy's quiet weeping. "You stood in the river," he said finally. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, weighted with a kind of awe she couldn't comprehend. For him, you stood against the cold. Esther could only manage a tiny, jerky nod. "The men who hunted him," Tashunka continued, his voice as low and hard as a river stone, "are cowards. They murder women and children for shiny rocks. They will be found." He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers. "What you did, that was not cowardice. That was a warrior's heart, in the body of a white woman." He placed a hand briefly over his own heart, a gesture of profound, silent respect that struck her more deeply than any sermon she had ever heard. They didn't stay long. They had to keep moving. But before they left, they built a small, smokeless fire and made her drink a hot, bitter tea that sent warmth creeping back into the deepest parts of her. They didn't leave until they were sure she could stand, unsteadily, on her own 2 feet. Then, as silently as they had arrived, they were gone. 2 canoes, swallowed by the darkness, leaving behind only a dying fire and the lingering scent of smoke. Esther stumbled back to the parsonage, a ghost returning to a life that no longer felt like her own. The house was cold and empty, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of stillness, of peace. She collapsed into her bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the sleep of the dead who had been granted a second chance at life. In the days that followed, something inside Esther had irrevocably shifted. Providence Creek went on as it always had, oblivious to the life and death struggle that had played out on its very edge. The townspeople still saw the preacher's daughter, still whispered behind their hands as she walked by. But she was no longer her father's shadow. She no longer felt their judgment. The freezing water of the creek had scoured that fear from her soul. She had faced a much greater trial and had not been found wanting. She had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, a strength forged not in a church pew, but in the icy crucible of that river. Weeks later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the plains white, a rider from a friendly trading post stopped at the parsonage. He had a package for her. It had been left for him, he said, by a Lakota man. Inside, wrapped in soft, supple doeskin, was a pair of exquisitely beaded moccasins, small enough for a woman's feet. Next to them lay a single, perfect falcon's feather, and beneath that, something else, a piece of news, delivered by the rider. "That fella, Vance," the rider said, spitting tobacco juice into the snow. "He and his men were found down south. Seems they ran into some trouble. The kind of trouble you don't walk away from." Esther didn't have to ask. Justice had been served, not by a sheriff's badge, but by the swift, silent laws of the plains. Tashanka had kept his promise. The new preacher arrived that spring, a nervous young man from Boston who was terrified of the vast, empty sky. Esther moved out of the parsonage and into a small, sturdy cabin she bought with the last of her father's meager savings. The towns still whispered, but their words were just wind now, a sound that passed by without touching her. She had her own ground to stand on, and the river, the site of her ordeal and her rebirth, started being called something different. The Lakota, in their travels, no longer called it Providence Creek. They called it Wiwi Zitkala Wakpa, the river of the Cardinal Woman, for the dark red shawl she had worn that night, the color of a steadfast heart. The traders and trappers who heard the name translated it more simply. They started calling it Brave Woman Creek, and the name stuck. It was etched onto new maps, a permanent landmark of courage, a quiet, enduring testament to the preacher's daughter who stood in its freezing water to save a child. And in doing so had finally, truly, found her way home. If this story of an ordinary person's extraordinary courage moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories you won't find in the history books.